My name is Elena Brooks. I was 29 years old when I learned just how disposable my parents thought I was. It happened on the day my grandfather's will was read, in a room that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money, where every surface gleamed and every smile felt rehearsed. I remember sitting at the long table with my hands clasped so tightly together that my fingers went numb, watching my younger sister across from me. She looked effortless in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, already leaning back in her chair like she owned not just the room, but the future. The lawyer cleared his throat and began with what my parents had already labeled, very loudly, as the important part. Before he could even finish his sentence, my mother leaned forward, her voice dripping with that sugary tone she used whenever she wanted applause. She announced that my sister would be inheriting $15 million from my grandfather's estate. My father slid a thick folder across the table toward her, and suddenly the room filled with murmurs, smiles, and soft congratulations, like we were watching the final scene of a feel-good movie. Then my father turned to me. There was no folder. No envelope. Not even a pity glance. He shrugged, as if what he was about to say barely mattered. He said my sister was getting $15 million, and as for me, I could earn my own way. According to him, my grandfather hadn't wanted me to have anything. My mother nodded eagerly and added that he'd been disappointed in me, that I chose my career over family, and that this outcome was exactly what he wanted. The room tilted, just slightly, like I was on a boat that had shifted course without warning. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the satisfaction of watching me unravel. I stared at the table instead, at my reflection warped in the polished wood, and listened as they rewrote the story of the one man who had always stood quietly in my corner. That was when the lawyer pushed his chair back. The sound cut through the room, sharp and final. He stood, adjusted his glasses, and said there was a second document. One that had been sealed, hidden, and deliberately kept from my parents. One that was only to be read when everyone was present. Especially me. Have you ever sat there while your own family decided you were worth nothing, and wondered whether you should just walk out or stay long enough to hear the secret that might change everything? Because what happened next is why my mother ended up screaming. Daniel Reed, my grandfather's attorney, didn't even blink when my mother snapped that there was no such document. He calmly pulled a thick, sealed envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the table like it weighed 100 pounds. He explained that my grandfather had given explicit instructions. This document was to remain confidential until the will was read in full, with all immediate family present, and with me in the room. The color drained from my mother's face. My father tried to laugh it off, muttering something about confusion near the end, about there being no need for anything else. Daniel ignored him. He broke the seal, unfolded several pages, and began to read. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear at first. Then his words landed, one by one, like they were aimed directly at me. To my granddaughter, Elena Brooks, he read, I leave full controlling interest in HarborMind Analytics, along with all associated personal investment accounts held separately from any joint assets. Daniel paused to explain that HarborMind wasn't a hobby. It was a rapidly growing tech company based in Atlanta, built around an AI platform designed to help small businesses manage inventory, cash flow, and marketing decisions. It already had contracts, revenue, momentum. It was worth far more than the $15 million my parents had just handed to my sister like a trophy. My father's smirk vanished. He blurted out that it was impossible, that his father barely knew how to use a phone, that he couldn't have built a tech company. Daniel met his gaze evenly and explained that my grandfather had hired the right people, learned what he needed to learn, and made sure everything remained solely in his name so there would be no confusion about his intentions. My mother leaned forward, her voice sharp and panicked. She said he hadn't been in his right mind. That he was old, sick, forgetting things. That he'd told them I wanted nothing to do with him. Daniel's expression tightened. He lowered his eyes to the page and kept reading. He wrote that he was fully aware my parents had been keeping me away from him. That plans were changed, calls redirected, messages erased. That they told him I was too busy, ashamed, uninterested. That they told me he was too tired, too confused, too fragile to see me. That he didn't believe any of it. My throat closed. Memories rushed back. Texts that were never answered. Calls that went straight to voicemail. Visits that were always postponed at the last minute. Daniel continued. My grandfather wrote about noticing large transfers from his joint accounts into cards and accounts controlled by my parents. Money used for travel, vehicles, and a lifestyle that revolved almost entirely around my sister. He wrote that when he asked questions, he was told he'd already approved them, even when he hadn't. He wrote that he might be old, but he wasn't stupid. My mother shot to her feet, her chair screeching across the floor. She shouted that it was a lie, that they took care of him, that they did everything for him while I was off chasing some ridiculous career. She pointed at me like I was the problem, like my existence was an insult. My father tried a calmer approach, suggesting paranoia, saying this was normal near the end. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He simply said the document had been drafted in his office, signed with medical clearance confirming my grandfather was fully competent. He was prepared to present those records if needed. Across the table, my sister clutched her folder like it might evaporate. Her mascara was starting to streak. She snapped that it wasn't fair, that she'd been the one there, that she took care of him, that people loved their videos together. That part hurt more than I expected. I had been edited out of my own grandfather's life while she turned him into content. Daniel finished reading and explained that my grandfather anticipated pushback. He left additional evidence, instructions, and documentation should this ever go to court. My mother grabbed my father's arm and hissed at him to do something. For the first time, he had no answer. He stared at the papers like a man realizing the numbers no longer worked in his favor. As I sat there, pieces started clicking together. Missed holidays. Cancelled visits. The way my parents insisted on handling all finances. To make things easier. The way my sister flaunted expensive trips with no real income. I didn't explode. I waited. Because one question burned in my mind. If this was only the beginning, what else was about to surface? And when Daniel mentioned my grandfather noticing messages disappearing, something snapped loose in my memory. Suddenly I was 14 again, standing on our front porch in Savannah, holding a flyer for a summer coding camp. My sister was twirling in the driveway in a brand new dance costume while my mother filmed her, yelling encouragement for her followers. When I tried to show the flyer, my mom barely looked at it. She said it was too expensive, maybe next year, and told me I spent too much time on the computer anyway. That was always the pattern. Money for my sister's competitions, costumes, and camera gear. For me, it was always later. At school, teachers praised my sister's confidence and stage presence. When they talked about me, it was always how bright I was, but how I needed to come out of my shell. My parents laughed it off like something was wrong with me. The first person who ever treated my interests like an investment instead of a problem was my grandfather. One afternoon he showed up with an old, scratched-up laptop he'd bought from a closing office supply store. He told me it had stories in it already, and now it could help me write mine. He ignored my mother's complaints about screen time and started bringing me books instead of candy. Programming. Data. Business basics. He didn't understand most of it at first, but he sat with me anyway, asking questions, making me explain things in plain language. He listened. And that was the difference. While everyone else rolled their eyes, he paid attention. That was the beginning of everything. One night, I walked into my sister's room and nearly slipped on sequins scattered across the carpet like someone had spilled a bag of glitter on purpose. She was standing in front of her mirror, switching outfits for a video, while my mom hovered behind her, fussing with zippers and telling her she looked like a star. My sister soaked it up like sunshine, spinning, pouting, practicing the same smile over and over until it looked effortless. I was holding a piece of paper so wrinkled it had softened at the edges. It was a chart I'd made, nothing fancy, just a messy little breakdown that showed how my grandfather's store could cut costs if he reordered certain items monthly instead of weekly. I'd been proud of it, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Because it meant something. I stood there, waiting for a gap in the performance, and finally I said, "Look. If Grandpa changes this, he could save almost $800 a year just on nails and screws." My dad glanced up from the hallway, where he was passing by, and gave it half a second. Half. Then he said, "That's nice, honey, but you can't run a business on pretend math from a teenager." My sister laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all day. "Wow," she said, eyes wide. "Nerd attack." And then they went right back to sequins and poses and lighting angles, like I hadn't even spoken. But my grandfather looked at it. The next day, he picked me up in his old truck and drove me to his hardware store like it was the most normal thing in the world. He walked me down the aisles, pointed at shelves stacked with paint cans and boxes of screws, and said, "Show me again." So I did. Right there between ladders and power tools, I held up my wrinkled paper and explained my little system. And he listened like I was someone he'd hired, like my thoughts mattered because they were useful. When I finished, he patted my head and said, "You see patterns the rest of us miss, Ellie. Don't ever forget that." I was 17 when I entered a local hackathon on a whim. The prize was small, just a scholarship and some recognition, but it felt huge to me. I built a crude dashboard that helped a hardware store track seasonal demand, what sold fast, what sat too long, what was profitable and what just took up space. It wasn't pretty. It was barely held together. But it worked. I remember standing on a stage in a blazer I'd bought at a thrift store, scanning the audience for my parents. They had promised they'd come. They'd even texted me that morning with a quick, "So proud of you," like that was proof they cared. When my name was called, I stepped forward, and polite applause filled the room. But there was one person clapping loud enough to cut through it. My grandfather, in his plaid shirt, grinning like I'd just won an Olympic medal. His hands were red from how hard he was clapping. Afterward, he wrapped me in a hug so tight it stole the air from my lungs. "You built something useful," he said, voice thick with pride. "Do you understand that? If you can help one store, you can help 10. If you can help 10, you can help 100. Then he dragged me over to the judges like he owned the place and made me explain my project again while he peppered me with questions. Could it predict when he'd run low on concrete mix? Could it warn him when paint was about to spike in demand? Could it help him decide when to do a sale? He looked at my work the way my parents looked at my sister's videos. Like it mattered. That night, my parents texted me a photo of my sister at the mall holding up a shopping bag, showing off new sneakers, writing, "Sorry we missed it, honey. Traffic was crazy. We'll celebrate later." We never celebrated later. The pattern repeated over and over until it didn't even surprise me anymore. My sister's milestones came with balloons and dinners out. Mine came with a quick, "Good job," tossed over a shoulder. Even when I got accepted into a top program, the praise felt like something they said because they were supposed to, not because they meant it. My grandfather never let it be small. He started asking bigger questions. What if there was a tool that could tell a shop owner exactly when to reorder before shelves went empty? What if a bakery could see which items actually made them money instead of just looking pretty? He'd sit behind the counter of his store after closing with a ledger open, tapping numbers with his finger, asking me what I noticed. At the time, I thought he was humoring me, letting me play at being important. Now I realize he wasn't humoring me at all. He was thinking like someone who had spent his life fighting to keep the lights on. Like someone who understood that a little improvement wasn't little when you were one bad month away from closing. My parents called me intense. Too focused. Too weird. My sister said I was going to end up alone in a dark room with screens and spreadsheets and nobody who actually liked me. My grandfather said I was going to change how people ran their businesses. He started using words that sounded too big for our kitchen. Partners. Investors. Platforms. When I joked that nobody would trust a young woman with their business data, he shook his head. "They don't have to trust you at first," he said. "They just have to see it works." So when I sat in that conference room years later and listened to Daniel reading my grandfather's words about calls being redirected and messages disappearing, it felt like the past and present collided. Because the truth was, my grandfather had been paying attention the whole time. He noticed when I didn't show up. He noticed when my voice didn't make it through. He noticed when money moved without his say-so. And he did something about it quietly, patiently, strategically. Maybe he built Harbor Mind in secret because he knew if he'd said a word, my parents would have gotten their hands on it. They would have taken credit. Slapped my sister's face on it. Turned it into a shiny brand opportunity. They would have drained it like they drained everything else, and I'd be left standing there watching them celebrate my future while pretending I didn't exist. Instead, he tied it to me. Locked it down. And waited for the perfect moment to make sure they couldn't twist it into their version of reality. I came back to the room with everyone staring at me, like I'd suddenly become an inconvenience they hadn't planned for. Daniel had stopped reading. Now he was watching my parents like he was waiting to see which lie they'd try next. And without planning to, I heard myself speak. "You told me I didn't matter to him," I said, my voice sounding unfamiliar in my own ears. "You told me he didn't want to see me." My mother crossed her arms like a wall. "Because he was tired," she snapped. "You weren't there, Elena. You don't know what it was like day to day." I leaned forward. 2 Christmases ago I bought a last-minute ticket home. I showed up at the house. You stopped me on the driveway and told me he was in a facility. No visitors allowed. My dad's jaw tightened. And later, I continued, slower now, I found out he'd been home the whole week. My father started talking about doctors and stress and how they were just protecting him. I didn't even raise my voice. "Funny," I said. He somehow had plenty of energy to be in all those videos my sister posted. My sister's head snapped toward me. "Those videos made him happy," she shot back. "People loved him." He smiled. He laughed. Daniel turned his attention to her like a spotlight. "Chloe," he said evenly, "did Arthur ever know you were being compensated for some of those posts?" My sister blinked. "What?" "Brand deals," Daniel clarified. "Affiliate links. Sponsored trips connected to content you filmed with him. Did you disclose those amounts to him?" Her cheeks flushed red. "That has nothing to do with this," she snapped. "I was building my career. Mom and Dad said Grandpa wanted to help. They said it was part of the plan." Then she looked at our parents, and I saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt. Not exactly. More like panic that she might not be protected anymore. I swallowed hard. "And the emails?" I asked. "The ones I sent begging to see him?" "You answered from his account. You wrote things like, 'Grandpa is proud of you, but he doesn't understand that stuff.' You told me to focus on my life." My mother slammed her palm on the table. "So now I'm a criminal for protecting an old man's peace," she shouted. "You didn't see him crying when you left. You didn't hear him say he didn't recognize you anymore." Daniel cleared his throat, calm as ever. "For what it's worth," he said, "Arthur never told me he didn't recognize Elena. He told me he felt his relationship with her was being managed for him." My father scoffed like that was ridiculous. "Managed is what you do for an elderly parent," he said. "You draft enough wills, you know how it goes. They get paranoid. They think everyone is stealing." Daniel didn't argue. He just reached back into his briefcase again. This time, he pulled out a small black flash drive and placed it on the table. "Between us." Arthur anticipated that response, he said. "Which is why he asked me to record a video when we prepared the codicil." My mother's hand shot out, frantic. "You're not playing some edited clip," she hissed. Daniel didn't look at her. He plugged the drive into the laptop, turned the screen so everyone could see, and hit play. And then my grandfather appeared on the screen, older and thinner than I remembered, but with eyes that were sharp and unmistakably his. The room went very, very quiet. And he began to speak. The video opened with my grandfather sitting exactly where we were sitting now, in that same conference room, like he'd planned the symmetry on purpose. He wore a pressed button-down shirt, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He looked older than the version of him that lived in my head, thinner around the face, but his eyes were clear. Focused. The kind of focus that never asked permission. A younger version of Daniel's voice came from behind the camera, asking him to state his name and explain why he was there. "My name is Arthur Brooks," my grandfather said evenly. "I'm here because I've become aware that my son and his wife have been using my trust in ways I did not approve." My father shifted in his seat. My mother stared at the screen like she could will it to stop. "I've seen money leave my accounts that I never agreed to," Grandpa continued. "When I ask questions, I'm told I already approved it, or that I'm confused. I am not confused." The words landed like stones. "I am old," he said, looking straight into the camera, "but I know what I earned, and I know who I wanted to go to." No one interrupted. No one dared. "I love all my grandchildren," he went on. "But only one of them thinks the way I do. Elena understands numbers. She understands systems. She built something small that helped a store like mine, and she never once bragged about it." He smiled then, just a little, like he was remembering something private. "Mark never listened when I talked business," he said calmly. "And Linda loves appearances. But Ellie listens." My chest tightened so suddenly it hurt. The video didn't stop there. "I've also seen how they keep her away from me," he said, his voice darker now. "Visits cancelled. Calls dropped. I'm told she's too busy with her big city job. Then I hear from Ruth that she drove all the way down and was sent home from the driveway." My mother sucked in a sharp breath. "I know what that is," Grandpa continued. "That's control. That's fear. Fear that Elena and I will talk and compare stories." He shifted in his chair, anger flashing across his face in a way I'd rarely seen. "If you're watching this," he said, "it means you're contesting my decision. It means you're trying to take what doesn't belong to you. So let me be very clear." The room felt like it was holding its breath. Harbormind Analytics, every share, every account connected to it, belongs to Elena. Not because she's my favorite, but because she's the only one who can use it the way it's meant to be used. His voice softened just slightly. "To help the little guys. The people running shops like I did." Daniel's voice came back, asking if he was under pressure from anyone. My grandfather snorted. "The only pressure I feel is time," he said. "I'm making this decision now while I can, because I know if I wait, they'll convince some doctor I'm senile and put whatever they want in front of me. I want this on record before that happens." The screen froze for half a second, then went black. No one spoke. The hum of the air conditioner felt unbearably loud. My sister's breathing came out uneven, like she was trying not to cry or scream. My mother's mascara had fully given up, dark streaks cutting down her cheeks. She looked at my father like he was supposed to fix this. Like there had to be a loophole. There wasn't. "You can take that to court," my father said finally, his voice thin. "A jury will see the years we spent taking care of him." Daniel closed the laptop with a soft click. "You're free to challenge the will," he said calmly. "If you do, the video, the financial records, and the physician's statement will become public record." He paused, just long enough to let it sink in. "And given the nature of the transfers we've documented," he added, "there may be additional questions raised that go beyond probate court." That was the moment everything shifted. My father stopped tapping his fingers. My mother stopped arguing. And I realized this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about exposure. The legal battle my parents threatened never turned into a dramatic courtroom showdown. Once Daniel filed the codicil along with the video and bank records, their confidence collapsed. They hired an aggressive attorney who swaggered into the first meeting like this was a misunderstanding he'd smooth over in an hour. He walked out looking pale and quiet. A forensic accountant was appointed to comb through years of transactions tied to my grandfather's accounts. Every luxury expense that had once been brushed off as family spending now showed up in spreadsheets with dates, amounts, and explanations that didn't hold up. The judge didn't care about heartfelt captions or smiling videos. He cared about the power of attorney my father used to move money. He cared about the timing of transfers right before vacations, cars, and sponsored trips. He cared about emails that vanished when questions were asked. When their lawyer tried to argue verbal approval, Daniel played the video again. The judge watched my grandfather say, clearly, that he was not confused. That ended the debate. The codicil was upheld. HarborMind Analytics was legally confirmed as mine. And on top of that, the court ordered my parents to repay what they had taken, with interest and penalties. They didn't have the money. They'd lived like it would never run out. To start paying it back, they had to sell the big house in Savannah. The one with the white columns and perfect lawn my mother loved posing in front of. The cars went next. The lifestyle followed. In a small town, news like that spreads fast. The admiration turned into whispers. The envy turned into avoidance. My father was placed on leave, then quietly let go. No company wanted an executive tied to a public record of financial misconduct. My sister's fall was different. Quieter behind the scenes, louder online. Brands stopped calling. Followers noticed old videos differently now. Screenshots circulated. Comments changed. Her tearful apology video didn't stop the algorithm from moving on. While all of that unraveled, I signed papers in a different courthouse room. Papers that cut the last financial ties between us. Daniel slid the final document across the table. Once you sign this, he said, they have no claim to HarborMind. Ever. My hand shook, not from doubt, but from the weight of finally being free. I signed. And for the first time, their disappointment couldn't touch me. I moved to Atlanta, close to the small team already working out of a rented office that smelled like fresh paint. Grandma Ruth came with me, carrying photo albums and quiet strength. My parents disappeared into a smaller life far from Savannah. And for the first time, the silence between us was something I chose. As I walked through the empty Savannah house one last time, I stood in the den where my grandfather once leaned over my shoulder, asking what the numbers meant. The house felt hollow. Like a stage after the show was over. But what he left me wasn't walls or furniture. It was belief. And that was just beginning to pay off. For years after that while reading, if you walked into HarborMind's office in downtown Atlanta, you never would have guessed how quietly it began. There were glass walls now, a clean logo mounted behind the reception desk, and a steady hum of people who actually loved what they were building. 50 of us filled that space, engineers, analysts, designers, support staff, all focused on one thing, making tools for people who didn't have the luxury of guessing wrong. People like my grandfather. Our platform helped small hardware stores, bakeries, barber shops, corner bodegas, places run by people who knew their customers' names but didn't always know what their numbers were trying to tell them. HarborMind translated chaos into clarity. When storms were coming, our system told coastal shops exactly how many generators to stock. When a bakery was bleeding money on items that looked beautiful but barely sold, our dashboards explained it in plain language. Every time a client said, "We survived this quarter because of your software," I felt my grandfather's presence like a hand on my shoulder. We hosted free workshops twice a month. Business owners crowded into our space, eating pizza, laughing nervously, learning how to read their own data without feeling stupid. I started a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name for students from working-class families who wanted to study tech. And every year, we handed out refurbished laptops to kids who reminded me a little too much of myself at 14. Grandma Ruth claimed the sunny corner of my apartment. In the evenings, we sat on the balcony with takeout, watching Atlanta glow. Sometimes she told stories about Arthur back when he was just a kid stocking shelves. Sometimes we just sat in silence, the kind that didn't need fixing. Then, 2 years after everything fell apart, my sister reached out. It wasn't dramatic. No demands. No excuses. Just a long email that sat unread in my inbox for weeks. When I finally opened it, she didn't ask for money or attention. She wrote about how fast everything disappeared once the image cracked. How sponsorships dried up. How she went from brand trips to clocking in at a marketing agency where no one cared how many followers she used to have. She admitted she'd been jealous of me for years. Jealous of the way Grandpa looked at me. Of the way I never had to perform to earn his approval. She didn't justify what she did. She just said she was sorry. I called her. The conversation was awkward and uneven, full of pauses where neither of us knew what to say. But we talked. Not as rivals. Not as characters in our parents' story. Just two women trying to figure out who they were without an audience. We weren't close. Not yet. But the door wasn't locked anymore. My parents never reached out. Through distant relatives, I heard pieces of their new reality. My father picked up basic bookkeeping work far from Savannah. My mother stayed mostly offline. The couple everyone once admired became a cautionary tale spoken about in lowered voices. Ruth and I built a quiet life. A real one. One that didn't need posing or approval. People like to say success is the best revenge. Maybe it is. But sitting there with my grandmother, knowing Harbormind was giving families like ours a fighting chance without lies or manipulation, I realized something else. The real victory wasn't money. It was freedom. The first time I told the story publicly was on a stage in New York, standing under bright lights with cameras trained on my face. My hands shook around the clicker, but my voice didn't when I began. At my grandfather's will reading, I said, my parents gave my sister $15 million and told me to earn my own. The room laughed, then went quiet as I told them the rest. Not every detail. Just enough. About being overlooked. About being underestimated. About one old man who believed when no one else did. When the applause washed over me, it didn't feel like validation. It felt like closure. Later that night, back home, I sat on my bed holding my grandfather's old wristwatch. The leather was cracked, the glass scratched. Inside was a tiny photo of me at 17, standing next to my first project, grinning like I'd just discovered fire. Engraved on the back were words he'd never said out loud. They never understood, but I always believed in you. For years, I thought winning meant forcing my parents to admit they were wrong. Somewhere along the way, I realized that wasn't the point. The point was that I stopped auditioning for people who had already decided not to see me. And that changed everything. For a long time, I carried this quiet belief that if I just succeeded hard enough, if I built something big enough, my parents would eventually have to look at me and admit they were wrong. That one day they'd call, their voices softer, and say they finally saw what I'd always been capable of. I didn't realize how heavy that hope was until I finally set it down. Somewhere between court filings and early morning meetings, between watching my parents' carefully curated life fall apart and watching Harbormind slowly stand on its own legs, I understood something that felt almost embarrassing in its simplicity. I didn't need their recognition anymore. I never really had. What I had was the one thing they could never take away, proof. Not proof for them, but proof for myself. Harbormind kept growing, not in the flashy, headline-chasing way my parents would have loved, but steadily. Quietly. We listened obsessively to our users. We fixed small problems that mattered. We showed shop owners their numbers without judgment. We treated their businesses like they mattered because they did. When a hardware store survived a slow season, when a bakery avoided closing its doors, when a family business lasted one more year because of a decision made with our software, that felt bigger than any applause. Every win felt like a conversation I was still having with my grandfather. Sometimes late at night, after everyone had gone home, I'd sit alone in the office and stare at the dashboards glowing. On the screens. I could almost hear his voice asking, so in plain English, how does this help someone like me? And every time, I knew the answer. Helping the little guys wasn't a slogan. It was a promise. I thought about that promise the first time I watched a student cry after receiving one of the scholarships we'd set up in Arthur's name. She told me she'd grown up in a family where college felt like a fantasy and computers were treated like distractions. She said no one had ever looked at her curiosity and called it valuable before. I didn't tell her my whole story. I didn't need to. I just told her to keep going, even when people tried to shrink her. Because I knew exactly what that felt like. My sister and I stayed in light contact. Sometimes we grabbed coffee. Sometimes months passed without a word. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no emotional speeches about forgiveness. Just two people slowly learning how to exist without the roles our parents had written for us. She worked hard. She kept her head down. And for the first time, everything she earned was hers. That mattered more than she realized. My parents remained distant figures. Occasionally, a relative would mention them in passing. A move here. A job change there. Nothing remarkable. No attempts to reach out. No apologies. And strangely, that stopped hurting too. Silence lost its power when it was no longer something being used against me. One evening, after a long week, I sat on my balcony with Grandma Ruth, the city lights flickering below us. She was knitting, the steady click of needles filling the air. After a while, she said, "Arthur would be so proud of you." I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. I already knew. Later that night, I took out his old wristwatch again. The cracked leather, the scratched face, the tiny photo inside. I traced the engraved words with my thumb, the ones he left behind for me when he knew he might not be around to say them anymore. For years, I thought being unwanted meant there was something wrong with me. That I had failed some invisible test of worth. Now I understood the truth. Being the overlooked child doesn't mean you're unworthy. More often, it means the people around you are too. Limited to recognize what doesn't fit their narrow definition of success. It means your value threatens the story they tell themselves, so they try to erase it instead. You don't have to stay in rooms where your worth is constantly up for debate. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to build something new. You are allowed to choose people who don't need convincing. And if you've ever been the one who got sidelined, blamed, or quietly cut out, I hope you remember this part more than the money or the scandal or the downfall. One person believing in you at the right moment can change the entire trajectory of your life. Sometimes that person is a grandfather with a beat-up laptop and a sharp mind. Sometimes, eventually, that person becomes you. That's the real inheritance.